Uh, it's our pleasure and honor to welcome Kateri DuBay to the Living History series to tell us about how one self-assembles a scientist.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm Kateri DuBay. I am an associate professor at the University of Virginia in the chemistry department, and my research group is focused on using computational tools to understand self-assembly in complicated environments, often looking at very simple models. So we actually have a little hexamer assembly model that's depicted here artistically that we're investigating. But I really want to focus a little bit more on sort of my path and how I got to be doing what I'm doing today. So my story starts in North Carolina, where I grew up. My dad was a scientist. At the start, he was actually doing a postdoc when I was born. And then, actually, sorry, he was doing his PhD when I was born. He thanked me for delaying him a year at when he defended. Without my daughter, I wouldn't be standing here today. I would have been standing here a year ago. Um, but anyway, he went on. He was doing a postdoc when I was quite young, and um, and then transitioned into being a science educator. And so he used to always come home and um, and really bring to life the natural world. So he would walk in the door and say, "Hey, did you see this thing outside?" Um, so one memorable time he walked in, we had had a snowstorm. There were some icicles, but it was starting to warm up. And he said, "Come outside." And there was a twinkle in his eye, and he said, "Look at that icicle out there." And there was this icicle hanging from a branch, but instead of these vertical icicles that I'm showing here, this icicle was hanging diagonally. And he said, "How do you think it got to be like that?" And then he left me to figure it out, and I will leave you to figure it out. So that's, some of the framework of what I was growing up appreciating was just all of these interesting questions in the world around me. In school, I was educated in the public school system in North Carolina, K through 12, and I was doing pretty well in school, but you were also as likely to find me reading a novel under my desk as paying attention in class. But one class that really captured my attention was geometry. So, what I loved about geometry is that everything was so logical. So, you got to make an observation and then you got to figure out what you could deduce from that observation, and then you'd write down exactly how you made that deduction, and then you would go forth and be able to prove something. And I found that just incredibly satisfying and beautiful. And that really stuck with me. So, at the same time I was going through school, I was also spending a lot of time babysitting, looking after my two little sisters, and the combination of the science and caring about kids made me think I wanted to be a pediatrician. So I was pretty set on that path. But junior year of high school, I had a pretty minor medical thing come up, but it was a little bit mysterious. So I went to one doctor. And they said, "Oh, it's not really our area of expertise. Go to this person, go to that person, go to this person." And in the end, they did some imaging, found something out, and it wasn't a big deal. But what I discovered was that the doctors I was seeing, they all just had their own area of expertise, and they were really practitioners. They weren't getting to do that kind of proof thing. And I thought, I'd really like to be able to follow up on questions, to be able to ask those questions. And if they're really hard and they take years to answer, I still want to be able to try to answer them. So that shifted my career path at that point, and I decided I didn't want to be a doctor. And so I went to college, but I was taking all the pre-med classes because I had already signed up that way, and decided I better get involved in research because I erroneously thought that the only things you could do with a science degree were become a doctor or go into research. There's lots of other options, but I thought, let me see about the research. So I got involved in a lab doing malaria research, and I found it really fascinating. It was looking at drug resistance in malaria parasites. And this lab actually cultured malaria parasites. And if you culture malaria parasites and do experiments in your lab, that means you actually have human red blood cells that you get donated from the Red Cross that you are working with. And I guess that was maybe a little bit too material for me. So I found myself moving from kind of helping out with the culture to moving towards a project where I was actually taking some NMR data that had been collected previously and doing modeling with it to try to come up with an appropriate model. And I didn't have a background in computational work. I didn't know how to program. I was just finding that there was a lot of support. There was a lot of message boards or chats that I could go to with my questions, and I could figure things out. And so then I moved in that direction. And in my PhD, I ended up doing atomistic MD simulations of proteins. And that was really fun work. And at that point, I was sort of trying to figure out, well, what do I want to do? Do I want to try to stay in academia or not? And I really liked teaching in the first couple of years and felt confident in it, but I wasn't sure about the research. I felt really kind of unsure if I could succeed at that. And then towards the end of my PhD, when things really came together, I thought, I can do this. I do want to do this. So I went on and did a research postdoc and enjoyed that time. But also, I knew it took a lot of luck to get an academic position. So I thought, whatever research I do for this time, I want it to be something that it has meaning in and of itself. And I think that let me stick with the idea of really finding a postdoc that I was excited about doing. So I did the postdoc and then applied for faculty positions. And actually, my husband was also applying for faculty positions. So we had a huge joint search. We both got jobs at UVA and moved down here in 2013. But then I took a little bit of an unusual path. I took a year before actually starting in 2014 to have a baby. And so my firstborn was 3 weeks old when I started, which was a little bit intense. He was a good napper, so that made it possible. And the computational piece meant that I wasn't setting up a lab. And then things have gone forward. So I had a second baby, COVID hit. And so my path towards the kind of during the pre-tenure years were a little unusual and a little elongated. But I built an awesome group and we did some really fun research. And this is now my family celebrating with me the morning after that my department voted me tenure a couple years ago. And I think I am, I believe, out of time now. So thank you for the time. And I'd be happy to tell you more about anything that you have questions
Thank you so much, Kateri. I'm clapping on behalf of the
on.
audience. Thank you for a wonderfully engaging and inspiring talk. Audience, please send your questions for Kateri to me via chat. Um, sorry. Um, Let me start with a question for you. What is it about the forbidden delight of reading a book under the desk that makes it so much better than reading it over the desk?
I don't know. Well, I mean, I didn't get in trouble if it was under the desk, right? Or at least the teachers who I am sure knew that I was reading the book under the desk could pretend that they didn't know. Um, yeah, but it does make it delightful. It's under same thing as like under the covers with the flashlight at night.
Right. A more serious question. Um, Something that you did not talk about in detail was the love for visualizing mathematics that is so intrinsic to geometry. How did that come up or play a role in deciding what you decided to do for research?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I didn't pull out that piece of the geometry class, but as I was thinking about, what inspired me along the way in this way, one of the other things that happened in that geometry class was we had a teacher who was very interactive and took containers of different shapes and poured water between them to demonstrate the volume and how different things worked. Um, and I think that that thread of liking to, yeah, visualize things or get it into a more tangible form really comes through in modeling when you're looking at things. I find that my students, they're very happy to look at the abstract data that comes out at the end of a simulation and often actually sort of skip the step of wanting to look at movies. And I find that kind of surprising to me, but also I think we miss a lot if you do that. So one of the first things I always say when something is strange or they see some result they don't understand, let's go back and let's watch the movies and see what we can see in that.
Um, Thank you. Last question. You are a woman member of faculty in STEM in the United States in 2024. Uh, as I understand, these this comes with unique learning opportunities and challenges. Would you would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I came in at an interesting time for my department. So we I was the fourth woman there. I think there was one who didn't get tenure and left. Um, and but shortly after I was hired, there were a couple more. And I was very nervous when I showed up, like about to start my job, kind of in that year in between, and I was very visibly pregnant and wondering how that would be received. But um, I have to say my female colleagues really came through, and they all but one of them had a baby within the next like 10 months. So that was like an amazing act of solidarity. Um, and I think there's definitely things that are challenges, that are huge challenges. But I think it's so much easier than when I look back at the kind of career path of our most senior female faculty member who just retired earlier this year. The kinds of things that she faced, yeah, were just astounding. And there's still a lot of barriers. I think there's issues with the equity of resources in the department in ways that are sort of hidden until you start to probe and start to ask those questions. And so we're still working on that as a department. But I think now this department that I'm in wants to work on it, and that's a really encouraging thing.
Thank you. On that very positive and encouraging note, I am closing the recording.